In today's episode, we're diving into 3 horrifying true stories of law enforcement officers eaten alive by deadly animals. From a wildlife officer in Japan ambushed by a massive brown bear, to an off-duty deputy in Indiana attacked inside her own home by a pit bull cross. But first, we start in rural Ohio, where a routine call led one deputy straight into the path of a violent and out-of-control chimpanzee. December 15, 2002 began like any other cold winter morning in rural Warren County, Ohio. A light snow had settled over the open farmland and a quiet stillness hung over the leafless woods. By 8:45 a.m., the roads were just beginning to thaw, and most of the town was easing into a peaceful Sunday routine. No one could have predicted that within the hour, a veteran sheriff's deputy would be dead, and a suburban home would be the site of one of the most gruesome animal attacks in the state's history. Michael "Mike" Reynolds, 43, had served with the Warren County Sheriff's Department for over 15 years. Standing 6 foot 2 inches with broad shoulders and a calm presence, Mike had a reputation for handling tense situations with empathy and patience. Born and raised in rural Kentucky, he'd grown up helping his father, a veterinarian, tend to livestock across the countryside. From a young age, Mike had learned that working with animals required a combination of caution and deep respect, lessons that stayed with him long after he traded farm boots for a badge. After earning his degree in criminal justice from the University of Kentucky, Mike moved to Ohio, where he married his college sweetheart, Sarah. They eventually settled in a modest home outside Lebanon and raised 2 children, Emma, 12, and Jason, 9. Weekends were reserved for camping trips, fishing, and teaching his kids the same quiet appreciation for nature that his father had once taught him. At the department, Mike was affectionately known as the Animal Whisperer. He was the first to be called for cases involving escaped livestock, wild animals, or even the occasional backyard python. His colleagues respected his calm under pressure and his ability to handle dangerous animals without escalating the situation. Just a month earlier, he had received praise for safely rounding up 3 runaway horses in the middle of a thunderstorm. December 15th marked the final hour of Mike's overnight shift. He was looking forward to attending his son's basketball game later that afternoon when the call came in at 8:47 a.m. A woman on Maple Grove Road had dialed 911 in a panic, screaming that her pet chimpanzee was attacking her husband. Chimpanzees, despite their frequent portrayal as friendly and playful in pop culture, are among the most dangerous animals kept in captivity. Adult males in particular possess strength far beyond that of a human, estimated at 4 to 5 times greater, and are capable of deliberate, targeted aggression. Weighing between 90 and 130 pounds, chimpanzees can generate over 1,200 pounds of pulling force, and their attacks frequently focus on the face, hands, and genitals of their victims. Known for their intelligence, chimps can use tools, plan actions, and assess threats with terrifying speed and precision. Caesar, an 8-year-old male chimpanzee, had been kept illegally by Sandra and Thomas Winters, a middle-aged couple with no formal training in animal care. Purchased through exotic animal traffickers for $50,000, Caesar had lived in the Winters home for 6 years. The couple treated him like a human child, dressing him in clothes, feeding him at the table, and allowing him to ride in their car. The garage had been converted into a private living space for the chimp, complete with a television, toys, and a bed. Despite concerns raised by neighbors and occasional warnings from local animal control, no formal action had ever been taken against the Winters. At the time, Ohio had minimal regulations regarding the ownership of exotic animals like chimpanzees, and Caesar had been acquired and kept largely under the radar. Law enforcement lacked clear authority to remove the animal without documented incidents of aggression, and with no prior official reports of attacks, the couple had faced no legal consequences, until it was far too late. When Mike arrived on the scene at 9:03 a.m., the Winters' 2-story colonial home looked calm from the outside. A dusting of snow coated the lawn and wrapped porch, but through the open front door, the sounds of chaos spilled out. shattering glass, a woman crying, and what Mike described in his final radio transmission as inhuman screaming. He radioed dispatch to request animal control backup, but the nearest unit was 45 minutes away. Sandra Winters, 52, ran from the house as he approached, her arms covered in blood and deep scratches. Inside, her husband Thomas lay unconscious in the kitchen, his face and neck mauled. Caesar had been confined to the garage, but the reinforced door shook violently under the chimp's repeated assaults. At 9:07 a.m., while checking Thomas's vitals and calling for EMS, a sudden crash rang out through the house. Caesar had broken through the garage enclosure's viewing window, using sheer strength to shatter the barrier and escape. The chimp covered the short distance to the kitchen in seconds. Mike attempted to deploy his taser, but Caesar dodged the probes with surprising agility. The chimp struck with both fists, knocking the officer into the kitchen island. Mike's radio skidded across the floor as Caesar launched a calculated, sustained assault. The chimp pinned Mike down and began targeting his face with bite after bite, his 1.5-inch canines tearing through skin, cartilage, and bone. Despite multiple efforts to reach his service weapon, Mike was unable to fight back effectively. At one point, Caesar grabbed a wooden kitchen chair and used it as a bludgeon, striking Mike's hand and sending the gun sliding under the refrigerator. The assault lasted nearly 8 minutes. At 9:17 a.m., officers Jessica Martinez and Robert Chen arrived at the residence. Through the front window, they witnessed Caesar kneeling over Mike's bloodied body, his fingers digging into torn muscle with disturbing precision. When they entered the house, Caesar charged. It took 4 rounds to bring him down. EMS arrived 5 minutes later, but Officer Reynolds was already dead. The medical examiner later confirmed that he had suffered massive trauma. A crushed larynx, multiple facial fractures, and over 30 distinct bite wounds. His service weapon was recovered unfired. Thomas Winters was pronounced dead at the scene, succumbing to massive blood loss and blunt force trauma before paramedics could intervene. During the investigation, authorities uncovered disturbing evidence that Caesar had exhibited increasingly aggressive behavior in the months leading up to the attack. Veterinary records and witness statements revealed at least 2 prior biting incidents involving Sandra Winters, neither of which had been reported. Caesar had also been throwing objects, damaging furniture, and displaying escalating territorial behavior, all warning signs that had gone ignored. Sandra Winters was later charged with reckless homicide, involuntary manslaughter, and illegal possession of a dangerous wild animal based on her failure to report previous attacks, the unlawful purchase of Caesar, and her ongoing negligence in housing a dangerous primate without proper containment. She pled guilty to involuntary manslaughter and was sentenced to 6 years in prison, along with a permanent ban on animal ownership. The incident shocked the Warren County community and reignited national debate over exotic pet ownership in the United States. Several lawmakers called for tighter regulations, but no immediate legislation followed. However, law enforcement agencies across Ohio quietly began implementing internal training protocols for responding to exotic animal incidents, many using the details of Officer Reynolds' death as a cautionary case study. At Mike's funeral, hundreds gathered to pay their respects. His daughter Emma read a letter describing her father as a man who always respected animals, even when they didn't respect him back. His widow, Sarah Reynolds, remained composed throughout the service, surrounded by family, friends, and fellow officers. The loss devastated the Reynolds family, who withdrew from public attention in the weeks that followed, focusing on grieving privately and caring for their 2 children. The community rallied around them, holding fundraisers and vigils in Mike's honor, ensuring his sacrifice would not be forgotten. But exotic animals don't just pose a threat in backyards and basements. Sometimes it's the professionals, those trained to handle wildlife, who end up paying the ultimate price. In our next story, a dedicated officer enters the forests of Japan and comes face to face with a massive Ussuri brown bear. October 9, 2021 began as a gray, damp morning in the remote mountain town of Ashoro, nestled deep within the rugged interior of Hokkaido, Japan. A steady mist clung to the trees, muffling sound and shrouding the trails in thick fog. As locals went about their morning routines, feeding chickens, collecting firewood, and preparing for the long winter ahead, none could have known that within hours a trained wildlife officer would be dead, killed in one of the most violent bear attacks in recent memory. Keiko Tanaka, 34, was a senior field agent with the Hokkaido Wildlife Patrol, an elite government unit tasked with managing human-wildlife conflict in Japan's northmost and most dangerous wilderness. Though only 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighing 125 pounds, Keiko was known for her steady nerves and professionalism under pressure. She held a master's degree in environmental science, had logged thousands of hours in the field, and was considered one of the country's most experienced bear response officers. Born in Sapporo and raised in a family of civil servants, Keiko was the youngest of 3 daughters. While her sisters pursued careers in education and healthcare, she chose a more solitary path. She spent most of her free time hiking, birdwatching, and photographing wildlife across Hokkaido's national parks. Her colleagues described her as methodical and unshakably calm, even in high-stakes encounters with wild boar, foxes, and bears. Her team still talked about the time she sedated a cornered boar with one shot while surrounded by panicking hikers. She didn't raise her voice, didn't rush, just moved forward calmly as if she'd practiced that exact moment 100 times. That morning, Keiko was dispatched to investigate recent bear activity near a closed logging road approximately 12 miles north of Lake Oneto. Over the past week, 2 goats had gone missing from a nearby homestead. Claw marks had been found on utility poles, and multiple hikers had reported overturned trash bins and damaged fencing. Authorities suspected a Ussuri brown bear was establishing a pattern of approaching human settlements, behavior that often precedes conflict. Ussuri brown bears, also known as higuma in Japan, are among the largest bear species in the world. Adult males can reach up to 1,200 pounds and stand nearly 10 feet tall on their hind legs, making them larger than the average American grizzly bear, which typically weighs between 400 and 790 pounds. Ussuri bears also possess longer limbs and broader paws, giving them a greater reach and stronger swiping power. Their claws, which can exceed 5 inches in length, are capable of tearing through tree bark, flesh, and even reinforced doors when food is involved. With a bite force estimated at over 900 pounds per square inch and the ability to sprint at speeds of over 30 miles per hour, Ussuri brown bears are apex predators by every measure. In recent years, Japan had seen a sharp rise in bear encounters, especially in the fall when Ussuri brown bears descend from the mountains in search of food, like acorns, chestnuts, and mountain grapes to fatten up before hibernation. A combination of deforestation, aging rural populations, and warmer winters had disrupted the bears' natural behaviors. With fewer natural food sources and fewer humans living in remote areas, the bears had grown bolder, venturing farther into towns and villages. In 2021 alone, there were over 150 reported bear attacks across Japan, the highest number in more than a decade. Hokkaido, home to the country's densest bear population, accounted for nearly half of them. Wildlife officials had warned that bears were no longer just wandering into backyards. They were now exhibiting aggressive behavior, breaking into homes, attacking livestock, and in some cases charging unprovoked. It was no longer a question of if someone would get hurt, it was a matter of when. Keiko arrived at the trailhead alone at 6:41 a.m. The area had been closed to the public and initial inspection duties were considered low risk. Following protocol, she radioed her location and began her assessment on foot, equipped with a tranquilizer rifle, a sidearm, and a GPS tracker. The temperature hovered around 35 degrees and visibility was limited to just over 100 feet due to dense fog rolling in from the west. At 7:04 a.m., Keiko reported fresh scat, overturned logs, and claw marks on a cedar tree. She indicated she would continue uphill to a clearing that offered a wider vantage point. That was her final transmission. At 7:17 a.m., Keiko missed her scheduled check-in. Her supervisor attempted contact multiple times with no response. A secondary unit led by Officer Kazumori was dispatched immediately. He arrived at her last known location at 7:52 a.m. What he found was a scene of violent chaos. Keiko's tranquilizer rifle was lying on the ground with the barrel bent backward at a near 90-degree angle. Her utility belt was torn and partially buried under brush. The nearby dirt was churned and slick with blood. 20 yards down a slope, a clear trail of broken branches and drag marks disappeared into the undergrowth. The attack had occurred with little warning. Based on forensic analysis, the bear had likely been resting just upslope, concealed in the thick vegetation. As Keiko passed below, the bear charged downhill, using gravity and speed to deliver a devastating initial blow. Its paw struck her left shoulder from behind, dislocating it and knocking her off her feet. She fell face first into the mud, briefly dazed, before attempting to crawl toward her dropped rifle. The bear descended quickly, pinning her with its full weight, estimated at over 800 pounds. Deep claw marks were later found across her back and thighs, indicating an attempt to hold her in place while inflicting maximum damage. The bear targeted her head and neck first, biting through the rear of her helmet and fracturing her skull. Her screams were likely muffled by the surrounding fog and heavy forest cover, preventing anyone from hearing her. Keiko tried to roll on her side, but the bear repositioned with chilling efficiency, tearing into her chest cavity with its front claws while holding her arm in its jaws. Evidence suggested she continued to fight. Her service pistol was later found 5 feet from the body with the safety off, but she never got a shot. The bear eventually dragged her further down the slope and partially buried her body under a layer of branches and pine needles, a behavior sometimes observed in bears attempting to cache food. Officer Mori located her body at 8:19 a.m. She had suffered catastrophic trauma, a shattered skull, crushed sternum, multiple spinal fractures, and extensive internal bleeding. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Later that evening, the bear was tracked by drone-mounted thermal cameras and dispatched by a ground team after it charged the responding officers. It was confirmed to be a large, healthy male in peak condition. There was no sign of illness or starvation, leading experts to conclude that the bear had simply become habituated to human presence, a growing issue in rural Hokkaido as food sources become scarce and natural barriers erode. Keiko's death shocked the region. It was the first fatal bear attack on a wildlife officer in Hokkaido in over 3 decades. A small memorial was held in her hometown of Sapporo, followed by a formal ceremony attended by forestry agency officials, local law enforcement, and dozens of wildlife workers from across the country. Her family declined all interviews, asking only for privacy and space to grieve. In the weeks that followed, the agency quietly updated its operational guidelines. Solo patrols and known bear activity zones were suspended, and all future inspections now required at least 2 officers and aerial drone surveillance in low visibility conditions. Though no public legislation followed, Keiko's death became a case study in risk management training across Japan's wildlife enforcement programs. Today, a weathered wooden sign marks the location where Keiko was last seen. Visitors hiking the old trail will find her name etched into the grain, alongside the date and a simple reminder of the danger that still lingers in the forests of Hokkaido. We've seen how deadly animals can strike, whether in the wild or during a routine call. But this next story stands apart. It didn't happen in a remote forest or at someone else's home. This time, the officer was off duty inside her own house, caring for a powerful dog with an uncertain past, and in a matter of minutes, everything spiraled out of control. May 9th, 2023 was a warm and quiet evening on the east side of Indianapolis. The air was thick with spring, heavy with the scent of budding trees and freshly cut grass. In the suburbs, children rode bikes between mailboxes, parents folded laundry in front of softly playing televisions, and neighbors greeted one another across trimmed hedges as daylight began to fade. There was nothing unusual about the stillness of that evening. No sirens, no alarms, just the everyday rhythm of life winding down. Inside a modest one-story brick house near North Millhofer Road, Marion County Sheriff's Deputy Tamika White and her 8-year-old son were finishing up another weekday. Tamika, 46, had been with the Sheriff's Department for over 15 years. She was a steady presence on the force, quiet, professional, and deeply dependable. At 5 feet 6 inches tall with a slim frame, she wasn't physically imposing, but she had a calm authority that earned her respect from both colleagues and community members alike. She had been a single mother since her son was born. Their home was clean and organized, filled with books, toys, and family photos. A small garden lined the front walkway, and inside, her son's latest school drawings were pinned proudly to the refrigerator. On duty, she was known for her consistency and sharp judgment. Off duty, she devoted herself completely to her child. Several weeks prior, Tamika had agreed to temporarily care for a dog, a large, mixed-breed male weighing roughly 90 pounds. The dog had come from someone she knew, a casual rehoming arrangement that wasn't uncommon in communities where people looked out for one another. It had no tags, no microchip, and no documented history of aggression. Muscular with a square head and strong shoulders, the animal resembled a cross between a mastiff and a pit bull. Tamika, experienced in handling difficult people and stressful situations, likely believed she could manage the dog without issue, and for a while it seemed like she could. Pit bull type dogs are known for their strength, determination, and high pain tolerance. Originally bred for bull baiting and later for dog fighting, they possess powerful jaws and a muscular build that can make them formidable in a confrontation. While many pit bulls are friendly, well-socialized pets, their physical capabilities mean that when they do attack, the consequences can be severe. Studies have shown that pit bulls and pit bull crosses are responsible for a disproportionate number of serious and fatal dog attacks in the United States each year. Their tendency, in rare cases, to launch sustained, unrelenting attacks without backing down can make even a single incident especially deadly. That evening, as the sun slipped low over the neighborhood, her son sat at the dining room table finishing his homework. Tamika moved between the kitchen and hallway, folding clothes and picking up after the day. The television murmured in the background. The dog paced through the living room, quiet but alert. There was no tension in the air, no obvious warning, just the soft domestic quiet of a mother and child at home. Then the dog lunged. The attack began in the living room. The first bite landed on her forearm as she raised it instinctively to shield her face. The impact fractured bone and tore through muscle, sending Tamika stumbling backward into a side table. Her phone clattered to the floor. She screamed, telling her son to run, her voice strained and sharp. The dog struck again before she could fully regain her footing. It clamped onto her leg and dragged her down. The weight of the animal pinned her to the carpet as it shook its head violently, tearing into her thigh. She kicked and fought, landing blows with her free arm, but the dog was relentless. Her son, crying in fear, stood frozen near the hallway entrance. She saw him and turned, pushing herself up from the floor, blood already soaking the front of her shirt. She moved toward the hallway, placing herself between the dog and her child. The walls were narrow and there was nowhere to retreat. Her body became the only barrier. As she raised her hands to push the animal back again, it launched upward, teeth locking onto the side of her neck. The crushing bite severed her airway and punctured deep into muscle and artery. She dropped to one knee, gasping, but remained in the fight, swinging with her remaining strength, dragging herself toward the bedroom door. Anything to pull the dog's attention away from her son. The hallway walls were marked with deep smears of blood. Her fingernails had scraped paint from the doorframe. Even as her legs gave out, she kept herself between the dog and her son. The boy took the chance to run. He bolted through the front door, down the steps, across the yard to a neighbor's house, screaming for help. His arms were marked with bite wounds, one shoulder torn, but he was alive. The neighbor dialed 911 at 7:45 p.m. When officers arrived minutes later, they forced entry into the home and found Tamika lying face down in the hallway. The dog stood nearby, its muzzle soaked with blood. The animal snarled and advanced toward the officers, forcing them to use shields and tasers to subdue it long enough for paramedics to reach her. Tamika was pronounced dead at the scene at 8:03 p.m. The injuries were catastrophic. Her trachea had been crushed, and her neck, arms, and upper torso were covered in deep, ragged wounds. Several ribs had been broken. Her forearm showed signs of defensive trauma, the skin torn where she had blocked repeated attacks. Her son was transported to Riley Hospital for Children, where he was treated for multiple bite wounds to his arm and shoulder. Though the physical injuries were not life-threatening, the emotional trauma was severe. Hospital staff noted that he remained in a state of shock for hours, unable to fully process what had happened. He was later released into the care of extended family who arrived from out of town that same night to be with him. Grief counselors and child trauma specialists were brought in to support him during the days that followed. The dog was euthanized the following morning by order of the Indianapolis Animal Care Services. With no identity tags, no microchip, and no veterinary records, there was no way to trace where the animal had originally come from or how many hands it had passed through. Animal Control canvassed the surrounding area and checked databases for any matching reports, but no one ever came forward to claim it. Whatever history the dog carried, whether neglect, abuse, or poor training, died with it, leaving behind only unanswered questions and irreversible damage. The death of Deputy Tamika White sent a deep wave of grief through the sheriff's department and the city she served. She hadn't died on a traffic stop or during a dangerous arrest. She had died in her home, off-duty, protecting her child from an animal she had likely taken in as an act of kindness. Officers held a candlelight vigil on the department steps that week. Candles flickered beneath a framed photo of Tamika in uniform. There were no speeches, just the sound of silence and shared mourning. Her funeral was held 6 days later. Law enforcement agencies from across the state sent representatives. Rows of uniformed officers stood at attention outside the chapel as her casket was carried outside. Her son sat quietly beside his grandparents, the folded flag in his lap nearly as large as he was. Inside the chapel, her captain spoke of her discipline, her quiet integrity, and her strength. Not the kind that makes headlines, but the kind that never wavers when it matters most. No charges were filed, the law hadn't been broken. Tamika had taken in a dog she didn't fully know, and it had turned on her without warning. Her death reignited conversations about large dog breeds, fostering practices, and the risks of informal pet transfers. But there was no single person to blame, just a moment of trust met with violence. Her name now appears on the Indiana Law Enforcement and Firefighters Memorial downtown. Beneath it is a simple inscription listing her years of service and the date of her death. She's remembered as a mother, a peace officer, and a protector. In her final act, placing her body between danger and her son, Tamika White fulfilled both her duty and her promise without hesitation. Thanks for watching this video. If you loved this video, you'll definitely also love the one on your end screen right now. Hope to see you there.